In today's video I will show you guys how to paint your Imperial Fist character models by painting Tor Garadon, the captain of the Imperial Fists' third company.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANS Miniatures.
I will go for a reasonably high standard, but the steps will be quite straightforward, and with some simplifications you could also use this method to paint your normal Imperial Fist models as well.
Painting yellow is not exactly the easiest exercise, but for Imperial Fists this is exactly what we need to do, and a lot, so it's important to have a good plan and to choose the right method from the get-go. I primed the model black, but painting yellow over a black primer is a form of masochism, and unless that's your thing, it's better to do a white zenithal highlight on the model first. This will allow me to have a good coverage on my base coat and to make sure that the colors will be nice and vibrant. Painting over black will always desaturate and dull down the colors to a degree. The next important thing is to choose the right base coat. I could immediately paint yellow, but that would result in a pretty flat and boring looking model, so instead I will start with a darker, super vibrant orange color, orange from Chimera. But you could also use something from another brand like Troll Slayer Orange, for example, from Citadel. I am painting over white, so covering the panels should be relatively easy, but since I am using orange, it still requires 2 or 3 coats to achieve complete coverage. But at this stage, it's very important to fully cover everything before moving on. If you skimp on the coverage here, you will end up with uneven, patchy looking armor and dull colors later on. Just use a big brush and allow each layer to dry fully before coming in with another one. As you can see, I don't worry too much about hitting something that is not supposed to be yellow later at this point. I try to avoid it when I can, but establishing the most important color on the mini is more important than neatness. I will worry about that later. Once I have a fully uniform base coat on all the armor panels, it's time to do some highlights. For the first layer I use the brush because the airbrush tends to desaturate the colors a bit, and I wanted the first layer to be as colorful as possible. But it is much easier and faster to create highlights with an airbrush, so that's what we are going to use. The first color I will be spraying is warm yellow from Chimera, and if you want to simplify the process, this is something you can possibly skip and immediately move on to the yellow. But I'm somewhat crazy about vibrancy lately, so I added this extra tone in between the orange and the final yellow highlight. The application itself is very similar to a zenithal highlight. I simply shoot from above at a roughly 45-degree angle and paint all the surfaces facing up, simulating light hitting the model from where the sun would usually shine from. The end result will not look as perfect as manually placing every light, but doing it is super easy and it will look good enough to trick your brain into thinking that the model is properly highlighted. After this intermediate step, I will move to the star of the show, the final yellow highlight. And I will do this with deep yellow from AK Interactive, which is currently my favorite yellow color, and coincidentally it is also a great color for painting Imperial Fists. If you don't have this color, you could replace it with something like Flashgitz Yellow from Citadel. The method is the same as before. I'm spraying many thin layers from a zenithal angle, covering most of the model, but building on and leaving the previous colors in the shadows. And while I'm mostly shooting from above, sometimes it's worth shooting a bit from the side or at least from a lower angle to exaggerate the light a bit. Ideally, you should not leave any orange showing on the surfaces facing up, so if you want to stretch the boundaries of the zenithal angle to achieve that, it's perfectly fine. Once I was happy with the result, I sprayed the whole model with some gloss varnish. This will help prevent the sprayed layers from reactivating while painting over them, plus it makes the colors look even more vibrant. And as an added bonus, it will also make it easier to correct mistakes I might make during the highlighting stage.
And with that, the yellow armor is done, at least for now, and it took me only around 20 minutes to do it, including cleaning the airbrush, so not too bad. But now it's time to move back to the brush and finish base coating all the rest of the model. First of all, I blocked in everything that was later meant to be either black or metallic on the model with black paint. And at this stage, of course, it's very important to not mess up the work that you have already done on the model, but as long as you take your time and use a nice sharp brush, it shouldn't be a problem. Just remember to dilute your black paint just enough to flow nicely, but not so much that you lose control of it. If you over dilute it, it will flow like a wash and will get into places you don't want it to, and if you don't dilute it enough, it will take you painfully long to get everything painted. To give you an idea, it took me 20 minutes to do all the blacks, so around the same time I needed for the airbrushing stage. Next, I moved on to the red colors, and here I wanted to differentiate between the trim on the shoulder pauldrons and the cape. I wanted the trim to end up looking nice and vibrant, so here I used a very pigmented color, Cartacci Red from Chimera, but something like Mephiston Red could also work perfectly well. For the cape, I wanted something less colorful and more brownish, so I added some black to the same red color, but something like Whole Red or World Bearers Red would also do the trick. The other big surface on the model is the wall Tor Garadon is standing on, and that is of course quite important since we all know that Imperial Fists are very fond of their walls.
I used dark sea grey to paint this particular piece of bulwark, but any light grey will do the trick as well. With that, I only had some of the smaller details left, so let's go through them fast. I painted the purity seal with some wine red and bone khaki. The hair got the same dark sea grey as the wool, and I'm sure there is some Imperial Fist symbolism hidden there. I covered the face in salmon skin, which will make him look angry for the entire video until I finish with the face, which I think is quite appropriate for him. I painted some of the lenses with turquoise and finally added some dry ground rain paste to cover the base.
Now that the whole model was base coated, I reached a point where I needed to figure out how I will do the shading. I basically had two options. I could either use oil washes like I did in my previous Space Wolves video, or I could do it by pin washing or black lining.
Since I already used the oil wash method, I decided to do the black lining this time. It might look scary, but it's actually much easier and faster than any of the other methods. It is worth mentioning that using acrylic washes isn't really an option, since they would destroy the work we have already done on the armor. I used whole red for this step, which is perfect for blacklining the yellow panels, but you could also use World Bearer's red if you use Citadel paints. I diluted it quite heavily until it was just a little thicker than a wash and used a sharp brush to paint it into the recesses and also where any two panels or elements meet. Just take your time and be confident with your brush. If you think about it too much, you will mess it up. But even if you do, you can simply wipe it away with a damp brush due to the gloss varnish we used on the armor. It doesn't need to be perfect either. If you have some stains on the edges, we will cover it with the edge highlights later, or you can simply treat them as battle damage. Speaking of battle damage, that was exactly my next step, since Imperial Fists can get a bit beaten up while defending their favorite wall, and in fact they prefer that look, I think. So I took the same whole red and dabbed a little piece of foam into it. I removed most of the paint from the foam on a paper towel, and then I started to dab the foam against the armor, especially on the edges and in places where it's likely to receive damage in a fight or during use. In the end, the most important thing is for it to look good, so if you think some damage would look great somewhere, then just add some chipping there. Just be careful not to overdo it, less is usually more when it comes to this. With that, the only thing left to do was to cover the base in Agaro's Dune's contrast paint to give it some depth. And on the rest of the surfaces I used darker colors so I wouldn't have to darken them down further, so no need for washes there.
With the shading done, let's do the highlighting next and start with the most important element of the model, the yellow armor.
Here I use the same deep yellow I used for the last highlight from the airbrush as well. Colors painted with the brush are always stronger and more vibrant, so this will work as our first brush highlight even if we had used it before. I used it to highlight all the edges of the armor, making sure that I don't cover up the chipping I had done earlier. I simply highlighted in between the chips as well as around them. Highlighting around the chips is also important because it will make them more three-dimensional looking, like there is an actual chip there and not just something painted on. It will make the battle damage more obvious and contrasty, better achieving that manly, wall-defending look that Tor Garadon likes so much. Then I went one step further and did some thinner highlights on the edges facing up and around some of the most obvious chips with lemon yellow. I tried to not fully paint over the previous highlight and do this either thinner, keeping the deep yellow still visible, or by painting only a part of the edge that I already painted with the deep yellow. For the trim around the shoulder pauldrons, I used the red from Chimera to paint the edges and the top of the curve where the light would hit the most. Then I started adding some deep yellow into the red to create a slightly lighter and more orangish tone and used this to highlight further until I was happy with the result. You could also get a similar result with Mephiston red, Wild Rider red and some Troll Slayer orange. For the Aquila I used some burnt red to highlight all the edges and left a little bit of black in the deepest shadows. Then I started adding a little white paint into the burnt red and kept highlighting thinner and on smaller and smaller parts of the edges. You could probably replace burnt red with corn red from the Citadel line to do the same. The cape was a trickier problem to solve. I was considering using an airbrush to avoid any glazing, but decided against it in the end. I started with the same Cartacci red mix that I had used before for the base coating, but this time with slightly less black added to it. I painted all the highlights on the surfaces that are in the light and also marked all the edges. Then I repeated the same process with even less black added to the mix until I reached pure Cartacci red. To smooth out the transitions I did a little bit of glazing in between the different layers. Finally I even added some white paint to the mix for the last highlights. For all the black and metal bits on the model I used the same combination of colors but in different proportions to create a difference between the two. The only real difference was some anthracite grey that I used to create the first highlight on everything that was supposed to be metal and not black. To be honest, this step can be skipped since I will mostly cover it with graphite anyway. The first color I used on both the blacks and the metals was graphite from AK Interactive. If I had to do this with Citadel colors, I would probably go for something like Dawnstone. I used this to paint all the edges everywhere, and for the black parts that was enough. I didn't need to paint any of the surfaces apart from a couple of scratches here and there. For the metal parts I went a bit further, and in addition to the edges I also painted some of the surfaces, especially when they were facing up. For the final highlight I used medium grey by AK Interactive, which you could replace with something like Administratum grey. On the black bits I painted only some of the edges with this, especially the most visible ones facing up. For the metal parts I used it more liberally to make them look brighter and stand out from the blacks. Finally I started painting the face, and to be honest I was so absorbed in this painting process that I managed to pull the model out of the camera angle like an amateur, so I will leave you with some footage of what I did manage to keep in the frame and focus. The colors I used were a combination of salmon skin, pink skin, deep yellow, white and laser yellow with a bit of anthracite grey glaze for the afternoon shadow on the lower part of the face. Then I finished some small bits and bobs around the model, like the lenses, a couple of edge highlights on the wall and some tufts on the base, and called it a day. And the end result looks like this.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit those subscribe and like buttons. It really helps the channel out. See you guys in the next one.